This week in wrestling history takes us back 38 years ago. On Christmas Day 1982, World Class Championship Wrestling presented its first ever Christmas Star Wars event in Dallas, featuring one of the most famous and successful angles of all time, which took place during the main event steel cage match between the visiting NWA World Champion Ric Flair and Kerry Von Erich for the title, with Freebird Michael P.S. Hayes, Bad Street USA, as the special enforcer. Hayes was chosen to be the referee because they wanted to have someone who could hold his own in there, since Flair had a rep. This is all kayfabe, of course, but Flair had a rep for winning many of his matches in controversial fashion. So they wanted to make sure everything was on the up and up. And so when Flair and Kerry both got knocked out during the match, Hayes put Kerry on top of Flair for the 3 count. But Kerry didn't want to win the match that way. Hayes argued with him and he went to go leave. Went to go walk out of the cage. In doing so, Flair shoved Kerry into Hayes and knocked him out of the ring. And when Hayes turned around, all he saw was Kerry. And he didn't know that it was Ric Flair who had caused the shove. Back then, you didn't have all the instant replay and the big Titantron screen where you can replay things the way you can today. So at least he didn't look as dumb as a lot of the baby faces do today when things like that happen, because you can get a million different replays of this stuff. Couldn't really do that on the spot back then. So he thought it was Kerry. And that's when Terry Bam Bam Gordy, another one of the Freebirds, slammed the cage door on Kerry's skull, turning the Freebirds heel for a legendary feud with the Von Erichs. Feud that made the promotion and made the wrestlers involved a lot of money. 37 years ago this week, on December 26th, 1983, my father was there for this show. And the reason he was there for that show wasn't just that it was Madison Square Garden. December 26th was his birthday. He would have been 63 years old this week. And so for his birthday, I think it might have been him and my grandfather, they went to the Garden that night. And that was a very important night because that was the night that Bob Backlund's 2,135-day reign as WWE champion came to an end. If you, of course, ignore the Phantom title change with Antonio Inoki, then you get to 2,135 days. That is the second longest reign in company history, behind only Bruno Sammartino's first run. He beat him out at 2,803 days. An infamous night of wrestling this was at Madison Square Garden. The evil Iranian, the Iron Sheik, had the All-American Bob Backlund in the camel clutch. Backlund was refusing to submit when his manager, Arnold Skoland, threw in the towel. And the Sheik was awarded the title, but his reign would not last very long. The very next day, on December 27th, at one of 3 WWE shows that night, just to show you how many towns they would run in a single night, they had an A team, a B team, and a C team. And I think on some days they had a D team. They could be running 3 or 4 different towns all over the country, or all up and down the East Coast. The schedule that they had these guys on back then was ridiculous. But on that night, one of the 3 shows was in St. Louis. And on that show, Hulk Hogan would make his return to the company after a 3-year absence, just fresh off his run in the AWA. And the following month, he would take the championship from the Iron Sheik back at MSG. Sheik was the bridge. He was the transitional champion to get the title off of the old babyface and onto the new one. And the reason being, Bob Backlund was asked to turn heel and drop the belt to Hulk Hogan. And he refused. And it wasn't a case of him refusing because he didn't like Hogan or he just didn't want to do the job or anything like that, or at least that's not what he claims. He talked about this in his book. He said his daughter at the time was 6 years old, and she was about to start school. And at that time, he was also going around the country, and he was hosting different Bob Backlund like children's wrestling tournaments. He was teaching them how to do things the right way and how to stay out of trouble and all that. And he didn't want to turn his back on those kids. And he also didn't want to run the risk of his daughter being bullied and picked on at school because her daddy is on TV being a bad guy. So he refused. He refused to turn heel. And so Vince McMahon was very surprised. Vince McMahon was shocked 10 years later when Backlund was sitting in his office at Titan Tower. And at that point, he was midway through his comeback. He had this big comeback in 1992 into 93. He was 43 years old at the time. They were going for the underdog story. Bob Backlund, he's coming back. He's going to try to recapture past glory. So by that point, when he's in that meeting with Vince, he's already about midway through his comeback. And it's not going so well. And Vince McMahon was shocked when Bob Backlund was the one who floated the idea of turning heel. This is when he realized that his big babyface comeback was kind of sputtering. It's not going the way he had hoped. And do you know who he credits for his preachy heel character on TV? He actually credits someone for that. Rush Limbaugh. So as he tells the story, Backlund is in his car. He's got the radio on one night, and he comes across Rush Limbaugh's radio show. And he had a caller on the line who was complaining about how awful her life was. I don't know. She was complaining about whatever. I don't know if she's complaining about her marriage or her kids or I don't know. But she's complaining about something. Woe is me. And Rush just had enough. And he went off on this woman about all the bad choices that she made in her life. And she didn't want to take responsibility for. And Bob had his eureka moment. That there were too many people who, in life, who wanted to take the easy road, who weren't willing to work hard for what they wanted. The world had changed so much, and he felt that he could become the bad guy by playing the good guy. The guy who blamed the fans and blamed society for everything that was wrong with society and everything that was wrong in their lives. The whole, I didn't change, you people changed. That whole thing. And it worked. But the only reason he didn't turn heel sooner is because his family was more important to him. And you got to respect a guy who puts his family first. 33 years ago this week, on the December 26, 1987 episode of WWF Superstars, which was taped many weeks earlier, Bobby Heenan and the Islanders kidnapped the British Bulldogs mascot, Matilda. Their match went to a no contest when they grabbed the dog and ran out of the arena with her. The Bulldogs, it always makes me chuckle when you see the Bulldogs chasing after them. And as they come through the doorway to go into the hallway in the back, I think Davy Boy slips first. I don't know if it was because there was something wet on the floor or what, but he kind of slips. He trips and falls. And Dynamite couldn't stop himself. And because Davey fell, then Dynamite ends up falling. So that kind of looked ridiculous. And then they're chasing after the Islanders trying to get their dog back. This entire angle was ridiculous. But it did lead to Bobby Heenan wearing a dog suit for a match. 6-man match at WrestleMania. The very next day, one of the most memorable debuts in wrestling history took place at a New Japan event at Sumo Hall. And what followed was a fan riot that led to New Japan being banned from holding events at that venue for 2 years. They weren't allowed to come back for 2 years after what happened on this night. Now, in recent weeks, in this segment, you have heard me talk about Antonio Inoki forming New Japan Pro Wrestling. He was looking to bring in, at the time, a new monster heel. He wanted to bring in a new monster heel character, and he had become familiar with a famous manga artist by the name of Go Nagai, who would go on to create the Jushin Liger character a couple of years later that spawned, obviously one of the most famous wrestlers in Japanese wrestling history. Vader was a character out of Japanese folklore. And the guy did the concept art for it with the samurai headgear. And I mean, it kind of looks like an elephant, but it's a samurai style headgear. And there are sketches. I don't know where they are exactly, but apparently there are sketches out there of the character looking ripped. So in its original incarnation, they were imagining somebody who almost just looked like this ripped superhero-like person, which is why Jim Hellwig was either the first or the second choice for the role, depending on, I mean, I've read it both ways. I've read differing accounts on this. I believe Hellwig was the first choice. Gary Hart, in his book, and shout out to Brian for sending me a copy of his book after he heard me mention, it was a mailbag question last week. Somebody mentioned the Gary Hart book, and it's out of print. It's been out of print for many years. And lo and behold, I received a copy of the book. So Gary Hart was working at the time with Hellwig in Texas. This is when he was Dingo Warrior down there in World Class. When he got the call from Pat Patterson to go work for the WWE. WWE wanted to bring Warrior in. Warrior was headed to Japan, though, were it not for that phone call. So, they made the better offer. He chose to go work for them as the Ultimate Warrior instead of going to Japan. And the rest is history. I mean, you talk about a decision that affected two different careers in such a dramatic way. That could have gone very differently. Sid Vicious was the other choice for the role, but ultimately, Inoki chose Leon White. And on this night, Vader was scheduled to tag with Masa Saito against Tatsumi Fujinami and Kengo Kimura. And before the match, somebody grabbed the microphone and challenged Inoki to a match. I guess on behalf of the team. I don't recall exactly who it was who issued the challenge. It might have been the manager. They grabbed the mic and they issued a challenge to Inoki. Well, Inoki was the main attraction, and he rarely lost. I mean, he rarely lost matches back then. It'd probably been at least a couple of years before he had lost the match at that point. That night, he was scheduled to have a match against another big name in Riki Choshu. So all of a sudden, somebody else wants to challenge Inoki. And the fans, this is where the trouble began. Because the fans picked up on this and they thought that they were about to be screwed out of their main event. That was the reason they bought the tickets to go to the show that night. They were expecting to see Inoki against Choshu. And at least some of the fans in the building thought, wait a minute, what is going on here? Are we not going to get that main event? And the fans were not very happy. They started throwing things into the ring, like eggs and beer cans. I'd like to think the fans always brought eggs with them to the buildings back then, just in case, the promoter tried to screw them out of their main event. Always have an egg or two in your back pocket. Just don't sit down on it. So eventually the match did happen. People got their main event. The problem is it lasted all of 6 minutes. And it ended when another wrestler ran in to save Choshu, who was locked in a submission. He refused to give up. So it ended on a disqualification. And the fans were not happy. All of a sudden, down to the ring comes Vader in his giant headgear, making his big debut. The gauntlet is thrown down to Inoki, and they have an impromptu match, which doesn't even last a full 3 minutes. And Vader beats him. He beats him with a power slam right there, 1, 2, 3, in the middle of the ring, clean as a sheet. Then he kept beating on Inoki when the match was over. He wouldn't let up, kept beating on him and beating on him. The fans are still very angry. Now, I'm sure you have a contingent of fans in the crowd who are shocked. They love Inoki, they're shocked that he lost, and they're upset about that and what this new guy is doing to him. But one thing I didn't realize many years ago when I had first heard the tale of Vader's debut is that the fans were probably angry about something else, even more than they were angry. It wasn't just that Inoki lost. I mean, it makes for a good story, but the fans were already in a very rowdy state, and they were more upset about their crappy main event, I guess, than they were about anything else. They felt cheated. They felt shortchanged. And the fans it was so out of control, it took the police an hour to get things under control. And New Japan was not allowed back inside Sumo Hall based on all the damage until 1989. 27 years ago this week, on December 27th, 1993, speaking of Vader, he defended the WCW World title in the main event against Ric Flair, one of my top 15 WCW matches of all time. 15 greatest matches in WCW history, that countdown I did 4 years ago. It wasn't a ranked list, but that match was on the list. If I did rank it, it probably would be in the top 5. I'd have to go back and see. It's a great match. This was in Flair's hometown of Charlotte, and you would think that this spot was tailor-made for a Ric Flair win, but that was not the original plan. Flair's spot was originally intended for Sid Vicious. Boy, there's a lot of plans with Sid Vicious that end up falling through if you look back over the years. But that was going to be Sid's spot. Sid was likely going to win the title that night, but then he and Arn Anderson almost killed each other over a pair of scissors overseas in the UK, and Sid got fired. And instead, we ended up with an all-time classic. Contrast that to what would come 1 year later at Starrcade on the same night, that very same date, 1 year later. We went from one of the greatest matches in Starrcade history to one of the worst, with Hulk Hogan defending the WCW World title against The Butcher. Not the Butcher from AEW. This was a very different Butcher. One of many, many, many names that Ed Leslie went by in his career. Also on that show, in, I guess it would have been 94. End of 94. Alex Wright pinned Jean-Paul Levesque, which was Triple H's one and only pay-per-view match in WCW before leaving for the World Wrestling Federation. 23 years ago this week, on December 22nd, 1997, WCW presented NWO Monday Nitro, which ran opposite a taped episode of Raw is War. I think it was taped about 10 or 11 days prior, which included Shawn Michaels dropping his European Championship to fellow DX member Triple H in a very hard-fought battle. Those guys had a hard-fought match that night. And a segment that they showed, now this did not take place in the same building, but what they did that night was they aired a segment, basically a dark segment, that was taped at the arena the previous week, that showed Stone Cold Steve Austin giving Santa Claus a Stone Cold Stunner. Santa was played by an independent wrestler from the Northeast. His first name was Roy. This according to Bruce Pritchard. And the little boy who was invited into the ring, who sat in Santa's lap and told him, "You're not the real Santa Claus," before Santa kicked him out of the ring and sent him back to his seat in the front row. That little boy, if you go back and you watch it, is one of the Usos. Now take your pick which one it is. I could tell them apart now. Some people say they can't. To me, it's pretty easy to tell them apart now. I think it was Jay. Just looking at the kid, I think it was Jey Uso, but it was one of Rikishi's kids. Fatu, he wasn't doing the Rikishi gimmick at that time, but Fatu was backstage. He had his kids with him that night, and they decided to use one of the twins in this angle. So technically, when you look back at the Usos, one of them, where did they make their debut? One of them made their debut in Santa's lap, right here on TV on this episode of Raw. But Stone Cold came out. He was not happy about the way he had treated this little boy, and Stone Cold came out and he gave Santa a stunner. Steve Austin is the only man in the world who can say that they have assaulted Santa Claus and the President of the United States. If that isn't enough to give the man GOAT status, then I don't know what is. But over on TNT, Nitro was a 3-hour show. It was the go-home show to their biggest Starrcade ever. Not before, nor after did they ever do as big of a buy rate as they did for that pay-per-view at the end of 1997. Near the end of hour one, the NWO started transforming the show into their own, and this took forever because they literally were transforming the show live on the air. It wasn't like, hey, welcome to NWO Nitro. In the middle of the show, they just took it over. So they're changing the signage over, and it was boring, is what it was. It wasn't very exciting. The next 2 hours, what it was an experiment to see how the show would do. WCW was getting ready to add a brand new show very soon called Thunder, which Eric Bischoff says he resisted as much as possible. He knew it was a terrible idea, but Turner insisted on it. WCW was doing so well, let's have another show. And Eric Bischoff realized why that was a bad idea, didn't want to do it. Ultimately, though, he had to do what his bosses told him to do. And so he claims that one of the main reasons why they expanded the NWO roster to these comically large proportions, they were adding people left and right, was because the idea is that NWO would get Nitro and WCW would have Thunder as their show, which is not unlike what Jim Ross has talked about the plan was in WWE for the Invasion, where they were going to give Raw to WCW. And WWE, like SmackDown, was going to become the WWE show. And, of course, it ended up not happening. But here in WCW, that was the idea. They wanted to test the waters and see, okay, maybe if Nitro becomes the NWO show and then Thunder becomes the WCW show, well, if we're going to do that, we need a roster for Nitro. There's got to be a whole bunch of NWO members because otherwise we're not going to have a roster. So, in effect, it was sort of the brand split, their version of one, before WWE ever did one. So it was an experiment. It failed. It failed miserably. The TV ratings dropped 25% in the middle of this show. And Raw that night actually beat Nitro in the 10 p.m. hour, which is just something that did not happen back then. It was a small victory, but it was a victory for WWE. And then Nitro that night ended with Hulk Hogan accepting a present, a gift box from a mystery sender. He thought it was Eric Bischoff. Oh, Eric, you shouldn't have. Eric's trying to tell him, Hulk, it's not from me. And Hulk's like, you shouldn't have done. And he opens the box. And what's in the box? Remember Brad Pitt? What's in the box? So I'll tell you what's in the box. What was in the box is the same thing that was in the box in the movie. It was Hogan's own severed head. They had a mannequin head for Hollywood Hogan, and this scared him so much. He just stood there. He was in a panic. He couldn't believe it. The final shot of Nitro that night was Sting. All of a sudden, here's Sting. Sting is standing on top of the entranceway. He's not all the way up in the rafters. He's right on top of the entranceway. And he is taking forever because they're going to do a zip line where he zip lines into the ring, and it is taking forever. Hogan is standing there staring at him, and Sting is trying to get hooked up and whatever, and he's waiting and waiting and waiting. He took the final shot. It took so long that by the time he was zipping so slowly that by the time he actually was almost to the ring, he didn't even get to the ring in time. He's about to zip line into the ring, and they had to cut him off, and the show went off the air because he took so long. That is how the final Nitro ended before the big Hogan-Sting match at Starrcade. 22 years ago this week, on December 27th, 1998, another nail in the coffin for WCW, and really the beginning of the end for them, as Kevin Nash becomes the first man to pin Bill Goldberg and end his undefeated streak, winning the WCW World Heavyweight Championship in the main event when Scott Hall cattle prods Goldberg behind the referee's back, and Nash powerbombs him for the win. 1 week later came the now infamous finger poke of doom on Nitro when Kevin Nash laid down for Hollywood Hogan to get the belt back onto Hogan. When the show was over that night, leaving the arena, the announcers for that night were Tony Schiavone, Mike Tenay, and Bobby Heenan. So as they're leaving the building, I think they were in D.C. They're leaving the building that night. Mike Tenay, who came up with the entire concept of the undefeated streak, that was his idea. Goldberg has credited him with the idea before. He and Bobby Heenan both told Tony Schiavone that the collapse of the company, it was only a matter of time. Like, this was the beginning of the end. And Shivani thought they were overreacting. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, didn't happen right away, but just over 2 years later, WCW no longer existed as a company on its own. Although, again, there were a lot of reasons for why that happened. Ending Goldberg's streak would not even be in the top 3 list of things that killed WCW, but you can add that to the list. 14 years ago this week, on December 23rd, 2006, Ring of Honor hosted its final battle show from the Manhattan Center. This was only my 3rd live Ring of Honor show. Jay and Mark Briscoe beat the Kings of Wrestling in what was supposed to be Claudio Castagnoli's final match before heading to WWE. And when the match was over, he cut a promo and he said that he might actually be sticking around for a little bit longer. So he must have known that things hit a snag with WWE. I believe it may have been a visa issue at that time. Whatever it was, he ended up not going to WWE for another 5 years. It's not like something that, all right, well, I have to wait a few months or, next year. He didn't go to WWE for another 5 years, did Cesaro. And 14 years later, I would argue he still has not realized his full potential. Shameful. This was also the Ring of Honor debut of sweet and sour Larry Sweeney as Chris Hero's new agent. One of the great wrestling tragedies was Larry Sweeney. That man would have been a superstar. Not a doubt in my mind. I'm sure anybody who knew him would say the same thing. The closest thing to a new generation version of Bobby Heenan or Jim Cornette was Larry Sweeney. And in the main event, Homicide beat Brian Danielson, call him whatever you want. He'll always be Brian Danielson to me, to become Ring of Honor World Champion for the very first time, ending Brian's 15-month reign as champion. And 2 years ago this week, this is a fun one to end on here. On December 21st, 2018, you've heard me talk about the greatest tweet ever twittered from Hulk Hogan, right back in 2011. Good night, Hulkamaniacs and jabroni marks without a life that don't know it'll work when you work a work and work yourself into a shoot, marks. That will never be topped. It should be framed and hung in the Smithsonian. But this may be my second favorite. Stephanie McMahon tweeted a Flashback Friday photo of her and her brother celebrating Christmas when they were little kids. Well, the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, was obviously going through his Twitter timeline, and he saw the photo. He saw the tweet that Stephanie shared, and he thought it was just the cutest thing. He thought it was adorable. And he decided to post a comment in response to this lovely photo. Said, "Merry Christmas. 2 handsome young men there." Oops. Yes, the $1 Million Man referred to the $1 billion princess as a handsome young man. Now, he later deleted the tweet, but as we all know, and now he does, the internet never forgets. And that is this week in wrestling history.